Before we go on to our next speakers, we have time for about 2 to 3 questions. So the floor is open. You can go down to participants on Zoom, and when you click on participants, you will have the opportunity to raise your hand, and Dr. Shortliff will acknowledge you.
I think the number of people is small enough that you can simply wave your hand into the camera if you turn your camera on, and we'll see who wants to speak. I see Tracy waving, so why don't we start with Tracy? And by the way, I think in light of Dr. Berwick's need to depart in about a half hour, we'll go ahead and let this be a bit more of an open discussion than just a couple of clarifying questions, and then we'll still ask Dr. Crossan to stay if he would, so that at the very end he can still be involved in the final discussion, okay? Sure. But let's have a little bit more time now with both Dr. Crossan and Dr. Berwick. And Daniel, you should feel free to participate if you have questions or want to engage as well. Tracy, you want to go first? Thank you.
Yeah, Jay, thank you so much for coming to educate us. That was really enlightening and inspiring, also a little discouraging in the sense that it sounds like MedPAC advised a solution to the Part B waste issue several years ago. And, what happened then? What if this committee made the same recommendation? What was the reaction?
I probably have to, thanks, Tracy, good to see you. I probably have to go back to Don's comments. Things move very slowly on the Hill in the best of times. And I don't know how to characterize the time we're in, but it's not the best of times. Sometimes, and I, during the time I spent on MedPAC, which was 12 years, actually 5 years as chairman, I saw a lot of ideas come forward and recommendations to the Congress. Taking a 20-year perspective, about 50% of what we brought forward was eventually either put into regulation or enacted by Congress. But in some cases, it took a long time. And it took repeatedly coming forward with the solution over and over and over again. And I think that's part of the political process, again, even at its best.
Great, thank you.
Other comments or questions?
Yeah, so this is Deb. So I have a question both for you, Dr. Crossan, and for Dr. Berwick, which is that there is a uniquely American appetite, I would say, for technological solutions to these kinds of problems. In other words, that there'll be some, so let's just imagine that Amazon Prime figures out a magic carpet drone solution that can exactly deliver 17.2 milligrams of those expensive drugs that all end in umamab to the northernmost corner of Alaska with the exact amount that you need. And the drone just drops the umamab in Alaska, Puerto Rico, Guam, exactly on the day that you need it. Can we tech our way out of this? Or do we need to really address the pricing regulation? Because it does seem that there is, as Americans, we like to think that there are technical solutions. Do you think that could ever work, or does it have to be regulatory pricing?
Well, maybe I'll start. I'm probably not the right person to answer the question because I never thought Tesla was going to be any good. But I mean, I think the issue about having the exact dose prepared and available at the right time and day from a technological perspective is kind of illusory. I think the argument that the manufacturers have made, and I've read up on some of this, that trying to prepare multiple vial sizes would potentially lead to another kind of wastage, which is basically expiration. Because it's just very difficult to get it right. To me, and I think this echoes what Don said, is taking the larger question in some ways. I actually agree with Don that ultimately, population-based payment takes care of that, but we're not there at this point, and that's a much larger problem to solve, but ultimately the right one. But I think that taking on the larger question of how much these drugs cost, and then looking carefully at the incentives all the way in that diagram, but particularly with people at the end who are the ones who are most able to think about and then properly customize what they're doing for each patient in such a way that it both is safe and improves quality, but also is thoughtful about cost, is the most likely solution.
Mm-hmm. That question was for Dr. Berwick to respond to as well. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree with what Jay said. The technical term for what Jay is referring to that would be my go-to here in industry is called mass customization, which is to standardize everything you possibly can so that there's a chassis which is entirely standardized. And then at the very last point, when you actually are interacting with the individual, that's where the customization occurs. And that's the conceptual model that's most likely to work here. Mm. In terms of, can you tech your way out of it? I don't know. Yeah, if the money went there, if that's where the resources, if that's where the return were, I'm sure industry would create a way to do it, whether it's an Amazon drone or not. I don't really know, but I think the main problem here is will. It's that you have to decide what you want to accomplish, and that once that's sorted, it's possible to design your way through this. I must share a story from last year. Maybe it was the year before. Speaking with an oncologist at a very well-known academic medical center who had encountered a paper that showed that a chemotherapy agent that everyone thought had to be delivered weekly could actually be delivered every other week with exactly the same clinical benefit. And so she naturally went to her hospital executives and said, guess what? We can save these patients a visit. We can reduce the total cost of administration by switching from weekly to biweekly visits. And she was told to go away. That the money that could be made on the weekly visits was just too much to kiss off. When you see behavior like that, you're dealing with design. That's not a technical problem.
Yeah.
So, Don, if I could just respond to that. I mean, I've seen cases like that, and it doesn't surprise me at all. And I'm going to speak about this drug pembrolizumab with similar issues. And I think one of the things that I've seen, having been in the States for 9 years, is that academic medical centers are placed on this pedestal of being, wonderful institutions of intellectual development. But to be perfectly honest, they are places for intellectual development, but they're also the businesses. And the business, from what I saw, plays a very strong role in some of these decisions.
Next on we do see some hands up now. So, Jonathan, you were next.
Thank you, John and Jay as well for those outstanding comments, and really appreciate it.
You be a little louder. Turn it up.
No,
you're not quite.
Still no.
Just speak loud, I guess, if you have a question. Yeah. Now we don't hear it all. You've got your mic off. Tell you what, while you work on the technology, let's go to Ken Silverman, who's next.
Hello. So my question is, you showed international prices compared to the United States price, and I was wondering if you have those prices individually or perhaps graphed in some way, and also, is there another country that you think is an outstanding model of pricing?
That slide was a combination of data from MedPAC, the MedPAC data book, and then an analysis done by ASPE. Both of the references are in the slide deck. So you can go, I just took, numbers from the ASPE and combined it with the MedPAC analysis to get that depiction of relative costs. And so if you go to that reference, you can get all the information about, which countries. It's sort of like OECD, but not exactly, which countries they were doing it with and the like. In terms of the international comparisons, I've had some experience in the UK with their system and NICE, and that has a number of characteristics which I think are of use. I've had a discussion with the French government 4 or 5 years ago with the Commonwealth Fund. I found their system to be a little less effective than they like to pretend it is. I think the one that may be closest to the kind of model that I've talked about Part D and where we're thinking about going with that. But the one I found maybe the closest, and I'm not an expert here. One I think I found the closest was perhaps the German model, because in Germany, they don't try to have the central government do all the negotiation. There's a cap, as you may know, on total expenditures, but underneath that, the Cronkite funds, the health plans, if you will, locally do the negotiation. And it may well be that in the end, and it's controversial, obviously, but it may well be in the end that a model something like that with real teeth might make the most sense. But people would disagree with that.
Thank you.
Hal, Health Has is next.
Thanks. So specific to the charge that this committee has, I'd be interested to hear from Dr. Berwick and Dr. Croson on an estimate. I know this is a rough estimate of what the savings would be with regard to Medicare for this drug in these vials, with regard to a more, what I'll call a global solution of value-based reimbursement, global reimbursement, capitation, whatever term we want to use, versus a more regulated approach, I'll call it negotiated approach, as you said, Jay, more of a Part D kind of an approach. And, just an estimate against the numbers you showed earlier of what the total spend is. I think it would be just interesting to hear what those parameters look like.
Wow. Don, would you like to start?
I'll introduce Jay Crossan to answer your question. I think how I don't. It's a great question, and I think maybe could be subjected to some serious analytics. But I would start with the right column on Jay's slide and just assume first that prices could change toward OECD medians or something like that. That would be a minimal calculation. It looks from what Jay showed us that we've got about 30 to 40% just on price reduction available. I don't remember the drug wastage figures from our studies, but they're pretty high. We're talking about 20-25% of the material being discarded, not mentioning outdated stuff. I would be very surprised if we couldn't cut the bill in half. And it depends on how hard we want to push on prices. And I think it could be achieved through administrative pricing or through other forms of regulation. But that'd be my gut estimate. Now, Jay will tell you the right answers.
Yeah, no, thank you, Don. I mean, I think it's the solution space, and I can't give you a number, but I think the solution space, is a combination of getting the incentives properly aligned, and they're not at the moment. Ultimately, and both of us said this as well, that, and this is hard, but I think we'll get there eventually, that if in this case, the providers, and perhaps as well as the intermediaries, have an incentive to both be thoughtful about safety, quality of care, and cost on a population basis, that's going to be key. But in addition, it's also about price. And just as Don said, I mean, we're so out of whack in the United States compared with what other developed countries are spending that, you really need to, have a two-pronged approach with this. And that's why, we took the approach, which has been quite controversial, of saying that companies that launch drugs at unacceptable prices in the United States compared with other places should be subject to some sort of retribution. And there's many models for that. Clawbacks are one, but another one would be to empower the purchasers to invoke an arbitration process, which could be potentially very difficult for the manufacturers. And I talked about it in Part D, but Joe Newhouse, 15 years ago, brought up this idea with respect to Medicare Part D, that in fact, binding arbitration, not just for high launch prices, but for unacceptable annual increases in the cost of drugs.
Yeah.
That pass some threshold, which the Congress could set, or it could give CMS latitude, but this could also extend. And one of the problems, I'm not going to get too involved here, but one of the problems of doing this just for Medicare is then your cost shift to the commercial side. So really the solution for Congress to take on is to fix the Medicare piece with these tools, but also consider the impact on the cost of drugs for the commercial marketplace. But if you were to do that, if you were to shift the power, essentially what you're trying to do here is you're trying to get, not hurt the pharmaceutical companies, but you're trying to get to a point where you've got an equal playing field, where the people who are paying for the drugs or representing the public have as much power in this game as the manufacturers do. And that's not the situation we have at the moment.
Ted, can I build on Frank's, on Jay's comments?
Yeah, sure.
A couple other responses, how I think your question is really, really interesting. First, I think the baseball arbitration approach that Jay put out there is really intriguing. It depends on who's on which side of who you have on the purchaser side of the table, because the purchaser has to have a real interest in the vector of outcomes we want. But that strikes me as having a lot of potential. I'd love to see what at least the game theorists would say, where that's going to bring us. Maybe Jay. I think that I'll three other comments. One is simplicity matters. When you, like me, had to take off your glasses and lean into your screen to understand that diagram Jay showed, we've built a very complex procurement and distributional system that's got to add cost. And I would say this may be beyond the charge of your committee, but some simplification is almost always a good idea. And we have a very complex system. I hope you will look at Civica RX. This is so they're going to test the limits here, Hal, because the way Civica is set up, they should produce cost of goods sold plus a fair profit. That should be the pricing that comes out there, which I think is where we want to end up in the long run. So I'd ask them the question as to how to find out what the fair, truly logical costing system would be. Finally, I'm going to make an editorial comment here. I personally am very worried about value-based pricing of drugs. I just think it's not logical to me that I can't think of another good in the society whose price is determined by its value the way we regard value-based pricing. So that's not a game I would get into to answer your question about finding the right cost.
Thank you.
We do need to move on, although I know that there are a couple more questions for Don. Jonathan, is there? I mean, I see your note, Deb. I know you want to move on, and I agree. But Jonathan sent me a message quite a while ago saying he really wanted to ask something.
Is my mic working now? Sorry. Can you guys? Okay, let's try this again. Now I've got the full.
You try to keep it quick and
the full headset
on as well, and we move on. I'm sorry. I know that Francis is getting nervous, so we do need.
You bet.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, these aren't short questions, but I'll try to just list them in order, and then we can go from there. So I think the comment was made by Don that in terms of looking at the budget from CMS, the astronomical spend that was made for these medications. So the question is, and it's come up by a couple different experts, is will reducing the waste actually reduce the spend? And we've had kind of comments on both sides of that, that actually reducing the amount of waste would actually not correlate with a reduction in spend. That's one. The other one is there was even some comments that we couldn't actually understand the acquisition price that physicians were paying to acquire the drug that they were using for the buy and bill system. So what are some approaches, and I think this is for Jay and Don, in terms of infusing some transparency in terms of understanding what was the acquisition cost from the physician side and getting that to better harmonize with the reimbursement price. And then finally, if there's if we have a preferred drug list / formulary for Part D, I've often heard that it can't be done in Part B, but why can't it be? Why can't we try to develop an effective preferred drug list? And I think you've talked, I'm well aware of CAP and I know learning more about DVP, but is that possible to develop a preferred drug list for the Part B system that has some teeth, and take any of those in order?
So let me suggest that we have Don respond and ask Dr. Crossan if he'd hold his responses and thoughts till the end, okay? So we can keep moving. But go ahead. Yeah.
I can't. Whether reducing waste would actually reduce spend. I guess it depends on what the exact details of the reimbursement system look like. I don't know the answer to your question, Jonathan. And the formulary question, I think I can address. The reason why Part B formularies have not been popular is that there is a real allergy in this country to government determining what your doctor can do. And once you begin go down that slope, saying Medicare is going to decide what can and cannot be given, you're into very, very risky territory that politically is really difficult. That would be my answer. Again, I think Jay, again, really would know more.
Thanks.
Okay.
Why don't I turn things over to you and we'll proceed, okay? And we'll come back to Dr. Crossan again at the end.
So, Dr. Berwick, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your contributions to the committee's deliberations on this challenging topic. Dr. Crossan, thank you.